Black Wave is on the air. Ready to hear a new scary story? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Antonio returned home late, tired after an endless series of meetings with customers. His apartment on the top floor of a modern building in the center of Valencia was his refuge, bright, minimalist, overlooking the ancient cathedral. When he opened the door, he felt a slight draft, even though the windows were always tightly closed. In front of the door was a small package wrapped in yellow newspaper. Antonio looked down the hallway. Not a soul. The sounds of the city came through the open passage to the stairs, but none of the neighbors were visible. Picking up the bundle, he felt something hard and rough inside. The ridiculous thought of it being a joke flashed through his mind. Stepping inside and turning on the light, he unfolded the newspaper. A shabby, old doll fell on the dark oak table. She looked as if she had survived more than 1 decade. The patchwork dress was faded, burned in places, and one eye was closed, as if broken. But what caught Antonio's attention most was the thin letters scratched on her chest. Laura. That name struck him like a lightning strike. Laura was his younger sister who had gone missing 20 years ago. Antonio felt his chest tighten. He picked up the doll, trying to figure out who could have planted it. No one he knew of Laura. It was a closed subject the family avoided. The doll was familiar, very familiar. It was one of the toys Laura had never parted with as a child. Antonio tossed the doll on the table and stepped back, feeling the strange chill that suddenly enveloped the room. Turning on the television, he tried to distract himself. The news, as always, was about traffic jams, but the sound suddenly disappeared. Instead, a thin, barely audible cry came from the speakers. He froze. The TV hadn't turned off, the picture was still on the screen, but the sound had turned into something he couldn't explain. It was a baby's cry, quiet, tired, but filled with such desperation that Antonio had goosebumps. He turned off the TV, but the crying didn't stop. It was no longer possible. The sound was now coming from deep inside the apartment. It can't be, he whispered, as if to himself. Checking every room, he found nothing. The doll remained on the table, its empty eyes seeming to follow him. Antonio suddenly remembered how, as a child, Laura had urged him never to leave her alone. You promised, Antonio. He had not kept his promise then. He was 12 and tired of sitting with his sister playing her games. He left her alone in the yard and went home. Laura was gone. No trace, no weaknesses. Just this doll that was found near the sandbox where she liked to play. Antonio grabbed the phone, intending to call his parents, but the lights in the apartment flickered and suddenly turned off. The apartment was plunged into darkness. Only through the windows in the living room was the faint light of street lamps. Antonio was looking for the phone in a panic when he heard a soft, faint sound. Footsteps. They were right behind him. Turning around sharply, he saw no one. But something had changed. The doll was now sitting on the edge of the table. It seemed to be leaning forward, looking at him with its remaining eye. Who's there? Antonio shouted. His voice echoed off the walls. There was no response. Then he heard a whisper. It was a girl's voice, quiet and cold. Do you remember? Antonio felt his legs give out. He stood there, dazed, unable to move. The whisper came again, closer this time. Do you remember, brother? The doll fell to the floor with a thud. Antonio summoned up the courage to pick it up, and at that moment the lights came back on. He stood in an empty, absolutely silent room. Only the doll in his hands was real. Antonio had been up all night. He tried to find explanations, but there were none. And only one thing he realized for sure. The past he had tried to forget was back. And it wasn't going to let go. Antonio couldn't throw the doll away. In the morning, as he brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, he looked at it as if it were something alive. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the ragged dress. He kept telling himself that it was a coincidence, that some lunatic's joke shouldn't scare him so much. But the doll didn't seem like a random gift. Remembering the night was hard. Every event seemed unreal, like a bad dream. But there were deep scratches on the floor that could not have appeared by themselves. By evening, he decided to figure it out. Laura had been missing for 20 years, but childhood was fresh in his mind, as if it had all happened yesterday. Looking for answers, Antonio headed to the old neighborhood where his childhood had been. The house they had lived in now stood empty, abandoned. The family had left, unable to bear the pain of their daughter's disappearance. But Antonio knew that their memories remained within these walls. The musty smell hit his nose as soon as he opened the creaky door. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the rooms held traces of the past. Scraps of old wallpaper, drawings on the walls, and most importantly, Lorena's room. It was as if time had stopped in her room. A bed with the bedspread they had bought before she disappeared, an old closet, and a broken record player. Antonio walked over to the closet and opened it. A box fell to the floor, littered with faded photographs and children's drawings. Among them he found Laura's diary. He recognized it immediately, the light blue cover on which she had drawn stars. Antonio had always known that his sister liked to write down her thoughts, but he had never read her diary. It seemed like an invasion of privacy. He sat down on the floor, blown by the draft from the broken window, and began to read. The entries began innocently. Stories of friends, school squabbles, the secrets children always keep in their hearts. But the further he progressed, the more he felt something unsettling. I saw him again. Today he was standing by the sandbox. Said he wanted to play. He has a strange voice, like he's not talking alone. Antonio frowned. He thought Laura was describing an imaginary friend, but the notes kept getting murkier. I don't want to go outside. He looks at me. His face is always different, and his eyes are too dark. Further on, the notes cut off. The last words, written in her hand, looked hastily written. He says we're going to go get the doll. I don't want to, but he says otherwise hell come for Antonio. Those words made Antonio's breath catch. Who was this? As if answering his thoughts, a rustle was heard in the room. Antonio turned around sharply. It was empty, but the sound was repeated. It came from the corner where the old closet stood. With an effort, he got up and walked over to the closet and opened it. On the shelf was a small box of dolls. Antonio froze. One of the dolls had an inscription scratched on it. Antonio. As he left the house, he felt a strange pressure in his chest. He took the diary and the doll with him, so as not to leave them in the empty, rotting house. The night began quietly. The doll lay on the kitchen table, and the diary lay beside him. Antonio tried to work, but his thoughts kept returning to his sister's last words. The clock showed 2 o'clock in the morning when he heard the first whisper. At first it was a barely audible sound, like a puff of wind. But then the words became distinct. Take her away. Antonio jumped up from his chair. The voice came from the kitchen. His voice. He stepped into the hallway. His heart was pounding in his chest. There was a light in the kitchen, though he was sure Head turned it off before he went to bed. There was a doll lying on the table, but now it was sitting up. Its head was turned toward the hallway, and it seemed to have a blank eye looking directly at Antonio. He took a step closer. The voice came again. You promised. Antonio grabbed the doll and ran out of the apartment. His feet led him to the bridge over the old River Turia. The city was asleep, and there was no one around. He threw the doll into the water, but instead of a splash, there was laughter. The empty, cold laughter of a child who could not belong to anything living. Antonio ran. When he got home, he locked the door and sat on the floor, trembling with terror. But when he looked up, he saw her. The doll was sitting on the table again, and this time her two eyes were looking directly at him. Antonio couldn't sleep. The fear that settled in his chest was irrational, but so real that every movement in the silence of the apartment echoed with flashes of panic. The doll stood on the living room table, motionless, but he could feel its presence as if it were watching him. At dawn, he gathered his courage to do what he had long put off: seek help. The first thing he did was call an old family friend, Manuel Garcia, who had been a detective all his life. This man had witnessed the investigation into Laura's disappearance, and if anyone knew the hidden details of that tragedy, it was him. Manuel didn't immediately agree to meet. The old story was painful for all involved, but after a short conversation, he suggested seeing each other at his favorite cafe on the outskirts of the city. The cafe was located in the shade of orange trees, and its cozy interior was in sharp contrast to Antonio's inner state. Manuel looked aged, but his eyes, sharp and keen, seemed to pick up every emotion in his conversation. "Are you sure you want to bring this up?" he began, crossing his arms. "I found something that got me thinking," Antonio answered, staring into his coffee cup. "A doll, with her name on it, Manuel Glum." "A doll?" Antonio recounted the strange events without leaving out any details. The night sounds, Laura's diary, the doll that returned as if possessed. "It sounds like you're going crazy," Manuel sighed. "But I remember one thing. When we were looking for Laura, we found this doll in the park. She had the same letters scratched on her chest. At the time, it looked like a prank by other kids, but now..." Manuel thought for a moment, then continued. "Do you know about the Ramos family home?" Antonio frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Ramos family owned a toy factory. They made that doll. After the factory closed down, there were some strange rumors about them. They said that one of the sons, David Ramos, was doing something, unclean. A few years ago, he disappeared, just like your sister." This information got into Antonio's head. He did not want to believe in mysticism, but the factory, strange coincidences, and unexplained events did not give him peace. When he returned home, the first thing he did was to open his laptop and search for information about the Ramos family. The only thing he could find was an old photo of the factory. The black and white image showed a huge building with boarded-up windows. In the corner of the photo stood a group of workers, among them a tall man with piercing eyes. Antonio looked away, but immediately felt his fingers trembling. Those eyes seemed to be staring straight at him. Later that evening, he decided to distract himself and check Laura's diary. At the end, between the pages, he found a folded piece of paper he hadn't noticed before. It was a drawing. It showed a girl holding the hand of something indistinct. The figure was dark, blurry, but clearly non-human. A doll stood next to her. Antonio felt the hair on his arms stand up on end. He put the drawing down on the table when suddenly the lights went out. The apartment fell into darkness, but not silence. A cracking sound came from the bedroom, like glass cracking. He went to the door and turned on the flashlight on his phone. The first thing he saw was the mirror. Its surface was covered in cracks like spider webs. As he got closer, he noticed an oddity. The reflection in the mirror didn't match reality. Behind him stood a figure. "Who are you?" he shouted, turning around. There was no one behind him, but the figure in the mirror remained. It was getting closer, as if with every glance it was trying to break free. Slowly, with unnatural movements, the figure raised its hand and pointed to the corner of the room. Antonio froze. The doll. It moved again. He felt like he was losing his mind. But that was only the beginning. Now, as he approached the mirror, a child's voice came out of it. "Why did you leave me?" It was Laura's voice. Antonio backed away in horror, but the figure in the mirror began to move faster. The crackling intensified, and in an instant the mirror shattered. Pieces of glass fell to the floor, but instead there was an imprint on the wall, as if someone's hands were trying to break through. Antonio ran out of the bedroom, but the door slammed behind him with a deafening thud. He was sure. He was haunted not only by memories, but also by shadows of the past that wanted to bring him back to the nightmare. The next morning began for Antonio with an oppressive silence. After his nightmare, he was afraid to go near mirrors, turn on the television, or even look out the windows. His apartment seemed hostile, every shadow evoking the feeling that he was being watched. A doll sat on the kitchen table as if mocking him. He knew that inaction only served to increase his fear. One had to keep investigating, even if it led him into the very depths of insanity. In the afternoon, he decided to visit the archives of Valencia. The Ramos family factory had been mentioned in old articles related to its closure. The local newspapers described the strange accidents that had happened to the workers and then to the children who played with their toys. One notice in particular caught his attention. In July 1987, 3 children disappeared without a trace in Valencia. All of them had last seen a toy produced in the Ramos factory. The parents assure that before the disappearance, the children complained of strange sounds and crying coming from the dolls. Police closed the investigation due to lack of evidence. These lines awakened long-standing fears in Antonio. He closed the newspaper, but for a second he thought he heard a faint sound from the depths of the archives. Through the muffled voices of the staff, he could hear crying. He left the building quickly, afraid to turn around. In the evening, back home, Antonio tried to relax, but the silence was filled with sounds again. It started with a quiet whisper from the next room. With each passing hour, the whisper grew louder, turning into a child's cry. It came from everywhere, from the walls, from under the floor, from the ceiling. Antonio couldn't stand it. He covered his ears with his hands, but the crying continued inside his head. "What do you want from me?" he screamed. There was no answer. But then the light in the apartment flickered, and the bedroom door slowly opened. A doll lay on the floor. She had moved again. Her eyes, empty and black, seemed to absorb all the light. "You promised," Laura's voice whispered from behind me. Antonio turned around sharply. The room was empty, but someone's handprints were on the wall again. The next day he called his parents. The conversation was difficult. His mother was reluctant to talk about the past at first. But under pressure, she admitted that on the day of the disappearance, Laura had indeed mentioned the boy's voice and talked about the gift he had promised her. "We thought it was fantasy," she said, "but now, if it's back..." "Antonio, don't get involved." Her words only spurred his resolve. He knew he had to go all the way, even if the truth was monstrous. The tracks led him to the old Ramos factory on the outskirts of town. The place had long been abandoned, but rumors of strange noises heard by the locals persisted. The factory greeted him with an ominous silence. The huge building, covered in moss and cracks, seemed alive, as if waiting for his arrival. Inside, it smelled of dampness and decay. Antonio walked through the main hall, littered with rusty machines and boxes of dilapidated toys. But one thing stood out among the chaos. On the floor stood an exact replica of a doll head found at home. He moved closer when suddenly he heard a quiet child's laughter behind him. There was a loud bang, as if a huge beam had fallen somewhere. Antonio turned around, but instead of a beam, he saw a figure. It stood in the shadows, hiding its face, but its outline resembled a child. "Who are you?" he asked, shivering. The figure did not answer. It began to approach slowly, and with each step Antonio felt the air grow heavier. Her eyes, empty as a doll's, stared straight at him. "It's your fault. came a voice. Antonio jerked back, feeling panic clutching his chest. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, but the figure continued to approach. Her voice grew louder, and now it sounded not like one voice, but like dozens of voices blended into a single chorus. "You have abandoned her." With those words, the figure disappeared, and the air was filled with a deafening wail. Antonio covered his ears and screamed, but the sounds did not stop. The place seemed to come alive, and all its walls were now screaming, accusing him. When he ran out of the factory, panting, everything was quiet again. But he realized the main thing. The doll was the key. To understand what had happened to Laura, he had to go back to where it all began. Antonio felt trapped between two worlds, reality and something that could not be described in words. It seemed to him that the doll was connected to another dimension, and that its presence in his life was destroying the very fabric of his mind. He spent the morning trying to organize everything he had learned. Old newspapers, Laura's diary, manual stories, and his own nightmares. The picture was eerie but coherent. The disappearances linked to the Ramos factory had begun decades before Laura, and each time they had been linked to toys. The doll he kept in his home wasn't just a random find. It was the bearer of something ancient and evil, and its power grew, fueled by fear and pain. Antonio realized he had to act. He decided to return to the factory, but this time prepared. Before going there, he stopped by the church where Father Lorenzo, a family friend, was serving. "Do you know anything about the Ramos family?" he asked, looking at the priest. Lorenzo froze. "Why do you ask that?" Antonio explained everything that had happened and showed his sister's diary. The priest's face turned pale. These toys, they were called vessels. David Ramos used them for his rituals. He believed he could communicate with the beyond through them. It was said that he made a deal with forces that can't be named. After his disappearance, the factory was shut down, but the evil remained. "What am I supposed to do?" Antonio whispered. "You must destroy the doll," Lorenzo said firmly. "But it is not so easy." Antonio returned home. Lorenzo gave him holy water and a prayer book, assuring him that it would help. But as soon as he opened the apartment door, he realized that the evil was already there. The apartment had changed. The walls seemed higher and the hallways longer. The air was heavy, like before a thunderstorm, and there were dolls everywhere. They sat on the floor, on tables, even on windowsills. Each wore the same faded clothes as Laura's doll, but their faces were distorted. "It's impossible," he whispered, taking a step forward. The dolls began to move. Their heads turned, their eyes staring blankly at him, and a child's cry came out of them all at once. Antonio rushed to the kitchen table where the original doll lay. He grabbed it, but at that moment one of the dolls fell off the shelf. Its broken face revealed something strange. There was a human tooth inside. He ran out of the apartment and headed back toward the factory. Dusk was thickening, turning the city into an empty stage set. Antonio felt that someone was following him. When he reached the factory, he was met with silence. But it was different now, tense, ready to explode. He entered the main hall, and his breath caught. Dozens of dolls lay on the floor, each one identical to the one he held. In the center of the hall stood an altar made of old bricks. On it lay the drawing Antonio had found in Laura's diary, but now the image had changed. A girl and a dark figure held a doll by the hands, and something huge, like a wormhole, towered above them. Antonio moved closer to get a closer look when the dolls began to move. They crawled onto the altar as if they were alive, and words began to come out of their mouths. "You are too late." He felt the floor beneath him shudder. Looking up, he saw that the walls of the factory were covered in shadows. They were moving, merging into one giant figure. "Laura," he whispered. A face emerged from the shadows. Her face. "Why did you leave me?" Antonio fell to his knees, feeling something huge and dark fill his mind. "I didn't mean to. I was looking for you." He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The factory came to life. The doll screamed. The walls cracked, and a strange odor filled the air. Antonio picked up a doll and began sprinkling holy water on it, repeating the prayers Lorenzo had given him. At first nothing happened, but when he repeated the prayer a third time, the doll began to crack. "No," cried a voice that was not Laura's voice, but something else. The altar lit up and the shadows began to retreat. The doll split in two with a deafening crack, and a horrible screech erupted from it, echoing through the factory. But at that moment, Antonio felt everything around him begin to crumble. He managed to run out of the building as the factory collapsed with a deafening crash. When he woke up, it was already morning. Only ruins remained where the factory had been. He still had the half doll in his hand, but it looked normal now. He felt a strange peace, but he knew it wasn't over. The events at the factory had left Antonio exhausted, but the sense of finality was deceiving. He returned to the apartment, hoping that it was over. As soon as he opened the door, however, the feeling of someone else's presence overwhelmed him again. The apartment looked just as had left it. Scattered papers, an overturned chair, but something had changed. The air was heavy and the silence was menacing. On the kitchen table lay the half of the doll head brought with him. Its empty eye sockets seemed to draw in the light. Antonio wanted to throw it away, but the feeling that this wasn't the end stopped him. During the night, the dreams began. He saw Laura, small as the day she disappeared. She was standing in the middle of an empty field, her dress crumpled and her face covered in dirt. She was holding a doll, but her eyes were dead, like all the toys he had seen in the factory. "Why didn't you save me?" she asked, her voice sounding muffled, as if through thick glass. Antonio tried to walk toward her, but his feet felt as if they were embedded in the ground. "Laura, I'm here," he shouted, but her face contorted into a horrible mask of pain. He woke up in a cold sweat. A doll lay on the nightstand next to the bed. The next day, Antonio visited the church to talk to Lorenzo. "It's not over yet," he said. "I feel that she is somewhere out there behind that doll." Lorenzo was silent for a long time before he spoke. "You have to finish what you started. There's one thing you haven't done. You haven't apologized." Those words sounded like a sentence. Antonio didn't know what he should apologize for. He was a child when Laura disappeared, and he couldn't have prevented it. "How can I do that?" "Go back to where you lost her," Lorenzo answered. Antonio reluctantly went to the park where Laura had disappeared 20 years ago. That place had become for him a symbol of pain and loss. It looked different now. The old swings were rusted and the playground was a deserted space with cracked tiles. He walked over to the sandbox, the same one where had last seen Laura. Her laughter still echoed in his head. Antonio put the doll on the sand and sat down across from her. "Laura, if you were here," he whispered, "I apologize. Forgive me for leaving you alone. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." The wind died down. The air around him became still. "Can you hear me?" he shouted. At that moment, the sand beneath the doll began to move. The little figure sank into the ground as if it were being pulled down by an invisible force. Antonio wanted to retreat, but felt his feet sinking into the sand. "You came too late," came a voice, low and shrill, not at all like Laura's. A shadow rose from the sandbox. It was huge, ethereal, but at its center was Laura's face, twisted with pain. "I've been here all this time," she whispered. "Laura!" he shouted, trying to reach her. "I'm here. I've come for you. You took my toy. Her voice grew colder. But it wasn't enough. The shadow began to cover him, and he felt the ground beneath him disappear. Antonio fell, sinking into the darkness, where thousands of voices, cries, laughter, and whispers were heard. He woke up in the same park. The sun was shining all around, and the air was as fresh as after a rainstorm. But the sandbox was gone. Antonio stood up, wiping his face with trembling hands. The doll was gone. He was alone. He thought it was over, but as he walked to the car, his gaze fell on the back seat. There lay a new doll. Her dress was bright red, and her name was scratched in big letters on her chest. Antonio.